Greetings Internet, it's Monica, and today I wanted to talk about anxiety. If you've watched my videos for a while, especially my vlogs, you'll know that I have been dealing with anxiety, but what you might not know is that I have had anxiety pretty much my entire life, and it's something that I've really had to reckon with and deal with and develop skills to combat and keep control of. And of course, over the years have also had a few tangles with depression. It's something that I'm not super secretive about. Like, I try to be pretty open about mental health because I think that it helps with getting rid of the stigma around it. And I know that for me, hearing other people talk about their own stories and struggles really helps me with my own. This is a video that I have really been wanting to film for like the last year. I've actually filmed it a few times, but I've just never felt like it was where I wanted it to be, so hopefully I finally achieve that perfection that I somehow believe is possible with this video. But basically, I wanted to talk about reading and anxiety and reading for self-care and self-care in general, because I have a lot of thoughts on all of these things. For me, for the longest time, I kind of saw self-care as something that I was like incapable of doing. And I think a big factor in this is because of the way that self-care is often presented on social media or talked about on social media as a sort of like one size fits all cure-all. You know, if you meditate for 30 minutes a day and treat yourself to ice cream, suddenly your mental health will be cured and perfect. And that is just not the case, or at least not the case for me. I'm sure for many people, meditation is amazing and very helpful and maybe even has like alleviated or cured whole things. For me, a lot of the things that are sort of shown as self-care on social media are actually like very debilitating for me and has previously like caused anxiety attacks for me. So things like meditation or taking a long walk or pretty much a lot of things that are meant to like clear your mind or allow you to like just not think just tend to freak me out and cause more issues than not. What I ended up realizing is that self-care doesn't have to be what it looks like on social media. It doesn't have to be what it is for someone else. So for me, I look at different ways of trying to clear my mind by distracting my mind, because when I am particularly anxious, basically what's sort of going on in my head is that I am jumping from thing to thing to thing, and my mind is going through these like spirals, and I can't really concentrate on anything, and it can be incredibly overwhelming and sometimes debilitating. And so for me, what I look for is I look for things that enable me to feel productive, but also sort of allow me to reroute my mind into something that I can focus on and not have that like constant loop going on in the back of my head. And for me, one of the best ways to self-care is through reading. And I think that there's a few reasons for this. One of them, I think, is just the fact of being able to sort of escape into someone else's problems for a bit. And not only that, but doing that often will sometimes give me clarity around what's going on in my own head, and if not that, at least some empathy for myself. Also, I feel productive when I'm reading, which like feeling unproductive is sort of like something that makes me very anxious. And so being able to feel like I'm accomplishing something is really important. And so even though reading is soothing and enjoyable and something I do for fun, it also feels like, because I'm learning and I'm bringing in a new story into my life. And I know that I can use that to create videos on YouTube, which then allows me to have even more creative output. So while it's not like productive in the sense of like work, I still sort of feel like I'm accomplishing something when I'm reading. I actually got interested in this recently, and I discovered that there's actually been a few different like scientific research around reading and mental health. One is that apparently like the act of reading helps lower your heart rate and ease muscle tension, which is like anxiety. It's not just something that manifests in your head, it also has physical symptoms, and so that helps with one of those physical symptoms of anxiety, which I thought was really quite interesting. Then also apparently reading can help reduce stress levels by like, I think it was like 60% or something. And it was just kind of cool to be able to see that there is actually a correlation between like reading and mental health. And you know, it's not like, I don't view it as like a cure-all or anything like that, but it's something that I know helps from my own experience, and it's cool being able to see like actual like science behind why it might be helping, if that makes sense. With this all in mind, I do try to prioritize reading as much as possible in my everyday life. Some days it's easier than others though, especially days where I feel particularly anxious. I've developed a few different tips that I try to use whenever I am feeling particularly anxious and know that I should read because it'll help me in the long run, but I'm struggling to do so. So these are some tactics that I use to help me when I'm struggling. Hopefully they're helpful to some of you, whether or not you have anxiety or just feeling particularly anxious for a day. And then also, of course, keep in mind that I am just a girl on the internet. I am not a mental health professional, and that if you do think that you have anxiety or you are dealing with mental health that is debilitating in your everyday life, I highly recommend, if you can, going to see a mental health professional. One of the first things that I did when it came to my reading was I tried to take away as much or some of the pressure. So for me, like I said earlier, being productive and feeling like I'm being productive is actually very beneficial for me mentally. And so I want to keep letting books feel like a way for me to be productive, but I don't want it to be something where I feel like I have to reach some level of perfection or where there's too much pressure on it. So one of the ways that I got rid of some of the pressure from reading is that I stopped, for the most part, requesting advanced copies from publishers. This is very blogger specific, so keep that in mind. But for me, that was something that just took away a bit of the commitment from reading and helped with not feeling like, oh, I have to read these books at this point, because when I want to read, I just want to read whatever I want to read for the most part, and I don't really want to feel like I have to read something in order to like hit a deadline or whatever. One of the things that I kept was I kept my Goodreads challenge, because I think that that has been really helpful with me feeling productive when I'm reading, but I don't set my challenge to 100 books anymore. I keep it at a 50, which I think, you know, pushes me to read a decent amount, but doesn't push me to like a breaking point with my reading. It's wild to me that like a lot of people read like more than 100 books in a year and it's like no big deal to them, but for me that's a lot. My second tip is to listen to audiobooks. So this is kind of a strange one maybe, but something that I actually like to do a lot is that I will read a book physically and then I will also listen to the audiobook at the same time. And I do this especially if I'm feeling like particularly anxious, because it really forces me to focus. Now, obviously, if my anxiety is really bad, this doesn't help either, but it is helpful for sort of moderate anxiety days. I think a part of this is just because you're sort of blocking off two of the senses, and it really forces me at least to focus. So this is why I'm so happy that things like Scribd and Libby, which is Libby is like a library ebook listening app. So both of those are what I typically use to listen to audiobooks, and then I'll also have the physical book. So I try to do that. I do that pretty frequently with books if I'm feeling really anxious, and it has been such a revelation for me. It has helped so much with my reading. So that's probably one of my top tips that I give to people if someone says that they're struggling with reading and anxiety. Like, that is the one that like has revolutionized reading the most for me. It might be weird for some people, it might be super obvious for others, but yeah, it's been an amazing asset. I definitely recommend checking if your local library has an app that they use in order to provide audiobooks, because, for example, the New York City Public Library uses Libby. My next tip is to try to have simple routines. So this is something that I try to do, but I also don't want to rely too heavily on, because I don't want it to be something where I need to have these like little routines in order to get myself to read, if that makes sense. But there are some things that I will do pretty frequently if I am struggling with reading or I just want to put myself in that mood. One is having background noise. I love thunderstorm sound. I will often listen to that. I'll also often make a big cup of tea to have by my side while I'm reading. I also have a specific playlist that I listen to every time I'm reading. It's all instrumental music and just like some of my favorite instrumentals. I'll link it down below in case anyone is interested in it. Basically, these like little sort of rituals or whatever you want to call them, they're helpful because when I do them often enough, they sort of automatically trigger sort of a feeling of wanting to read or being in the mood to read, if that makes sense. So helpful for me. They're also just like really nice things to do for myself, and I feel like doing nice things for yourself in general is always a good thing and makes me feel a little bit happier and like calm. So I try to do these things just to like put myself in a good mindset, and then hopefully reading comes with that. A couple others that might be a little bit odd, but brushing my teeth and washing my face are like oddly really helpful. I think it's like an element of like taking care of yourself, and like it's like a weird way of just like reminding yourself that you're alive and you're good, and like prepping for bed. I don't really know that like any sort of like real reason why it might be helpful for me, but those two things also like help calm me, make me feel a bit better. And again, I like to do them before I read at night at least, and they usually help a little bit with getting myself in like sort of a good mental place. Lastly, I try not to look at reading as a cure-all or any form of self-care as a cure-all. This is something that I feel like with mental health and like mental health journeys, you kind of go through waves, or at least I have, where it's like, oh, this is the thing that's going to finally change me. And then it's like, oh no, that's not going to do anything. Forget about it and like toss it to the side. Whereas instead it's like, oh, this is the thing that's going to help me, maintain. And I'm going to do these things in order to help myself not like crash. So for me, it's important to look at reading as something that I do in order to manage my anxiety, not to cure my anxiety. And again, that's how I try to view self-care in general. I, of course, try to have other strategies that I use if I'm feeling anxious. So for example, writing it all out is a huge help for me, like just getting, like, whether it's in a journal or just in the notes app on my phone, just like writing how I'm feeling, like just throwing it all out there. That often really helps. Sometimes talking it out with other people helps, but I will say that I have to be really selective about who I turn to when I want to talk to someone because of anxiety. Because oftentimes, and I don't think this is a bad thing, but I feel like oftentimes when you go to someone with an issue, they want to solve it for you, and they want to offer advice, or they want to explain away your worry. And when you're anxious, like that's not really something, like you can't explain away anxiety. And oftentimes when that happens, it ends up making me feel even more anxious and overwhelmed. So that is something that I try to keep in mind if I am like actually seeking someone out to talk to about anxiety. But yeah, I try to have like sort of other tactics that I use in order to manage anxiety. But yeah, hopefully this video was helpful in some way for some of you. And I'd love to know if you guys have any self-care tactics that you turn to when you need them, or if there are any. Oh, I guess that's one that I didn't mention, is that I will often have a list of books that like I view as my anxiety books. And these are basically books that like have pretty low stakes plots and are very atmospheric and very sort of like cozy books that I turn to. A lot of Jane Austen novels, for example. So that's sort of another random tactic that I'll throw in there. But I'd love to hear from you guys if there are any like tactics or things that you use for self-care, or like books that you turn to if you're feeling anxious or anything along those lines. And yeah, I'll talk to y'all next time. Bye.